Well, good morning, everyone. This is Keith Eastland with Miller Johnson. Welcome to our 8 a.m. daily webinar. This morning's topic is going to be Executive Order number 70, Return to Work Issues for Construction. Before we begin, we'd like to share a few of the news stories or data from the prior day. It looks like we are up to 3.6 million cases of COVID-19 worldwide, with over 250,000 deaths. In the United States, 1.2 million confirmed cases, with deaths exceeding, unfortunately, 70,000. In Michigan, we are up to 44,397 confirmed cases as of last night, with 4,179 deaths. So those are the statistics. Interestingly, news story, a Michigan-made vaccine is being put into clinical trials from Pfizer. So a little Michigan connection and maybe some advancement there, which would be great. Also interesting, if you're curious, there's the AMA, Hospitals and Health Systems report, American, showing that, or not showing, but reporting that in 4 months, the healthcare systems in our country have lost over $206 billion. So there's been this real strong push to collect data on the impact that the shutdowns and COVID-19 are having on our healthcare system and its stability going forward. And I think that's becoming an increasing concern here in Michigan and communities all across the country. So we'll keep an eye on that. With that, we're going to get started on the topic for today, which is Executive Order 70. So where do we stand in light of Executive Order 70? Where are we? Well, we're still in a global pandemic. And, you know, everybody understood that it was an uncertain emergency, I think, back in early March. A lot of unknowns. But I think what we're hearing more and more now is, look, this is a new normal. Everything I read, everything I hear seems to be suggesting this is something that we're all just going to have to deal with for quite some time. In political news, Governor Whitmer decided to end the emergency, the state of emergency that she had declared, supporting all of her executive orders, which there's a 1976 law that required her to do that. But then she turned around in the same night and unended it or extended it, however you want to view that. And so now, according to Governor Whitmer, we have an emergency in Michigan, a state of emergency related to COVID-19 through at least May 28th, unless she extends it further. The Michigan legislature, the House and Senate, did not agree to extend her emergency further as it did last time. Instead, they took the position that they would give her a short extension, but they proposed some legislation to codify or put into law some of the things that they thought ought to be made law, and they wanted to have a role as things moved forward. The governor said no to that, and they are expected to file a lawsuit claiming that the governor does not have authority anymore to unilaterally issue executive orders, and her current executive orders may be called into doubt, will be called into doubt under that lawsuit. We anticipate that could be filed as early as this week. Rumors flying last night that I saw or heard were maybe even today, this afternoon. So stay tuned for the legal fight there. But for now, we still have an emergency through May 28th in Michigan, and we have a stay-at-home order that extends through May 15th. And one of the things to keep in mind in one of Governor Whitmer's press conferences, when she was explaining how she planned to slowly lift restrictions and to get Michigan's economy back up to speed, she suggested or said it would be like a dial. She would turn it up when things were safe in her view, and if data started looking like they would be unsafe, she might dial it back. And so what does that mean for us? That means for us that we're going to have to keep a close eye on the executive orders and the requirements for the state so we understand what they are, as well as I think you need to keep a close eye on what's happening legally with her authority. The summary, finally, great news. All the other states around us seem to have gotten the good understanding that construction could be performed safely for the past month or so at least. Michigan has been a little bit slower to the game, but it is now considered resumed activity and permitted. So it's broad construction industry. There's really no limits as we can tell. And that'll be effective at 12:01 a.m. on May 7th, so tomorrow. Okay, what do you need to do? Well, under the executive order that I'm sure many of you or your safety managers or your other managers have looked at is implement and follow sort of two sets of rules under the executive order, as I call them. The first is the in-person work requirements, okay, and those are more general. Those were included when she lifted the restrictions for some other industries like landscaping. And then the second group is the new enhanced social distancing rule, and that's paragraph 11, H and I of the executive order. Okay, before we get into each of those groups of, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that we can operate? I want to just remind everybody, and we'll come back to this at the end, that there was an executive order, a stay home, stay safe executive order that Governor Whitmer had issued directing and making it the public policy of the state of Michigan for anybody that contracted COVID-19 or displayed symptoms of COVID-19 or who had close contact with somebody that tested positive or had principal symptoms of COVID-19. This executive order made it public policy for those folks to stay home and self-quarantine, okay? And those have not lifted. And so it's good to refresh your memory on those because you're going to have workers, employees who will be affected. And as this thing spreads and there's going to be more close contact, there's going to be family members. And so you've got to remember that employees and individuals are being instructed to self-quarantine for certain periods. And we're going to come back and bring this full circle at the end of the webinar here when we talk about return to work issues. But don't forget, that is still out there. Okay. All right, so what do we need to do? What are the in-person work requirements, what I would call the first group of requirements that the executive order is going to require? The first is a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan. If your company has been operating at all during this shutdown, you should already have one of these. It's a requirement, and what the executive order states is that it should be consistent with the federal OSHA guidance, which is the guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID-19. That's the title of the OSHA guidance. If your safety managers are interested, there's links to this obviously easily on the website, but it requires a written document that shows what you're doing for preparedness and response plans. There are a number of things that need to be included. In our experience, most of our clients have already been doing all of these things, and it's just a matter of taking all of your policies and all of your practices and pulling them together or linking them in one nice short, reasonably short, I should say, document that if someone says, hey, why is Eastland construction working? Where's your preparedness and response plan? You can pull that document out and you can say, here it is. Of course, it can incorporate more detailed guidance in your safety manuals and those sorts of things. But it shouldn't be a very difficult document to prepare if you haven't done so already. Miller Johnson, we have a sample preparedness and response plan that we can provide to clients. I've given it to clients, and what I've done, and I find this to be quite successful, is we have a half-hour or 40-minute call, and we just kind of go through that and what you're currently doing to make sure, okay, what's the best way the quickest, best way to protect yourself to make sure you have a preparedness response plan. Incidentally, I should note that if you haven't seen it already, Miller Johnson has a back to work resource page. that employers, clients can subscribe to that is going to be updated weekly with work product, with links, additional things. It's not going to replace our daily webinars. We're still going to do all of those, but it's an additional platform that if you're interested, you should check it out. One of the things we're going to do, and it should be up later this afternoon, is have a specific tab for industry-specific pages, and there'll be a particular page for construction, and then we will put all of our sample and model documents related to construction there as well as links. So if you're interested, look for that. And of course, you could always just call me and we can, or whoever you work with at Miller Johnson, and we can get you the sample preparedness response plan. Interestingly, make sure that your subcontractors and anybody that you engage to work on the projects that you're on also has one of these things, right? Make sure that happens as well. Okay, so that's the first thing. Next thing, only necessary employees promote telework. This is pretty straightforward, right? You got to make sure that we're not sending more employees than we need to. If anyone ever asks, you want to make sure you can say, yeah, we thought about that on each of these projects. You know, I need 15 tradesmen. I don't need 30. Now, maybe you do because you're behind on your timelines, given all of the delays that have been imposed by our government here. But make sure that it's justified, right? So if you ever get asked, you can explain why you're sending the number of employees you are sending to the job site. Promote telework. If certain people can work from home, they should. That's pretty easy. Social distancing practices here, we're just talking about maintaining that 6-foot rule that I'm sure we're all kind of sick of hearing about now, but that's pretty straightforward. You have to make sure that, this should be in your plan as well, your preparedness and response plan, that you have an increased frequency on when you're going to clean and disinfect areas, commonly touched areas, equipment, anything like that. Also, if you haven't been working or you haven't done this yet, do you have a written protocol for what you're going to do if and when, because it will happen, and it's happening more and more with our clients, is I have a positive test. What should I do? Many of you have already thought through that. Many of you have already dealt with that. And you know, kudos for you for managing that process. But there is value, I would suggest, in making sure you have a written protocol so that if you get asked from employees, if you get asked by subcontractors or vendors or owners, this is what we're going to do. These are the steps. We're going to work with the public health authorities. We're going to maintain confidentiality to the extent we can. Here are the things we're going to do to contact trace, right? Because we have to notify people who are in close contact with, let's say, a superintendent who may have bounced around in different areas on the site. You know, if that's the kind of person that tests positive, you want to make sure you have that written protocol in place. Miller Johnson has a sample that we can provide as well on that front if you haven't already seen one or developed one. Next thing you have to do for the in-person work requirements, and these are the general ones again, is develop policies to screen and prevent employees that either have symptoms or if they've been in close contact with someone having COVID-19, that they're not coming to work, right? And you'll see more specifically in the enhanced requirements where that comes into play. And then we have to make employers that are going to have in-person work, they have to make non-medical grade face coverings available to employees. Okay, so doesn't have to be medical grade mask, it can be face coverings. Attorney General has said, look, if for some reason you can't get masks, because we all know they're really hard to get from suppliers, hopefully that'll be getting better. Document your efforts to try to get them and to make them available for your employees. And it looks like the AG has acknowledged, the Attorney General has acknowledged she's not going to seek to enforce that if people are making good faith efforts to get the masks, face coverings. Okay, let's talk about the enhanced requirements. These are the ones under paragraph 11I of the executive order that are required for construction and the outdoor, other similar outdoor activities that have been that I should say will be permitted May 7th. Don't have meetings or gatherings if people can't social distance, right? So on-site safety briefs, anything like that. Make sure you do it in a way that you can maintain that 6-foot distance between people. Otherwise, do a Zoom meeting. Don't have those in-person meetings. Next one's common sense. Limit your in-person contact with owners, suppliers, other tradesmen, foremen on the project. If somebody comes and sees a site and it looks like nobody's practicing these social distancing things, everybody's going on like business as usual, that's when that's going to be reported back to the governor, and that's when we're going to be worried about this dial up, dial back. We don't want that. So make sure you're taking efforts to do that. You have to provide PPE, gloves, goggles, face shields, and masks. You've got to limit the sharing of tools and equipment, right? Make sure that if there's a piece of equipment that has to be shared, it really has to be shared. And make sure that when you're limiting the equipment, if you can't limit it, if it has to be shared, make sure that it's cleaned before and after use, okay? And make sure you document that. I have an issue right now for a client in Ohio where people are complaining that that's not occurring. There's a written protocol, they've got signs, and it makes it real easy if you do those sorts of things and communicate with your employees, puts them at ease. Because remember, a lot of what we're going to be doing here is compliance with the legal part of this, but I think more importantly from your perspective is how do we do this in a way that makes our workers and the folks that we're on the job with comfortable, right? How do we get our job done? How do we get the project done safely and on time while making, not making people feel uncomfortable when they come to work, because that'll cause its own set of problems. So, all right, this is last bullet point here is a big one. Each project must have a site-specific supervisor, okay, for the whole site that is responsible to monitor and oversee all of the COVID-19 control strategies. Okay, this person must be a supervisor. They must be on site while all work is accomplished. Okay, it can be someone that's already on site for another reason, so they can wear 2 hats. And I think it's reasonable if you want to split this up, if you have somebody there on certain days and, it's Eastland and then it's, Smith the other day. You can have more than one person, but it's got to be clear to everyone on the job who's in charge of the COVID-19 control strategies. So if you're a construction manager, general contractor, you're in charge of the job site, you're an owner, make sure you have in writing and everybody knows who the site-specific monitor, and you want that anyway, right? Because if anything happens, if there's any concern, if there's a positive test, you want that one control person. So make sure you designate that person and make sure they understand, and then make sure they're trained and understand all of your preparedness plans and your protocols, practices, all of that stuff. Because what we don't want is somebody that says, yeah, I'm in charge, and then they get asked questions and they're not ready to react and take the prompt mitigation efforts, right? Construction, we don't want to be the meatpacking industry, right? Where you're hearing stories of, lots and lots of positive cases and spread, which everyone thinks, well, that must happen on the job. We don't need a high profile or large construction project in the next 3 weeks to have a blow up of COVID-19 cases. That's not good for anyone. So make sure that the person in charge, the designated, knows exactly what to do immediately and who to contact to get questions answered. All right, let's go to the next set of enhanced requirements that we're continuing through. You must conduct daily screening. So this applies to every contractor on the job site. Of course, it can be coordinated through the general, but you have to screen workers, visitors entering the job site, and you have to include a questionnaire about their symptoms, possible exposure, and a temperature screen if possible. Now, you don't have to take temperatures. It's encouraged. If possible, if you have a touchless thermometer and you can direct all of your contractors to get one on site, great. That's ideal. But if you can't, you still have to screen for temperature. And so you should develop a written questionnaire daily that folks can complete, and it can be documented that, yes, we've screened every single person here that came in. The executive order requires you to have dedicated entry points at the construction site to conduct this daily screening. And so make sure you have those. And then you can document it, I think, how you want to reasonably. I think there's good flexibility here on what works best for you and your organization and each particular job. But one of the things that the executive order suggests is, you can track it by stickers or other indicators, right? Like green sticker or a yellow sticker or pink sticker, for people that are, screened today. That way it's clear that if anyone comes and says, well, this person wasn't screened, well, no, I got a purple sticker today because it's Tuesday. That sort of thing. Whatever works best, but you've got to document and make sure that whatever protocol you put in place, you can show that, yes, you are screening everybody on that site. So probably more additional admin work, but again, we don't want some sort of mass outbreak or large outbreak, and then somebody comes in and looks and says, well, wait, how did you track this? This person came in a back gate and didn't get screened, and we could have avoided all this. That's the last thing we want. So a lot of control is important here. Okay, if workers cannot maintain the 6 feet social distancing while they're working consistently, then you must require them to wear masks or face shields. So go back to the general requirement. You have to make available non-medical grade face coverings and masks. So if an employee asks for one, you have to make it available. If they can't stay 6 feet apart wherever they're working, if they're in a confined space, if they're working with a partner, on a project and they can't be 6 feet apart, you must require them to wear the face shields or masks. Okay, so that's a difference. So they're required to wear them here. You're required to make them available to everybody. Okay. So that's an important distinction to note. Okay. And let's make sure that you have to make sure that people are instructed on PPE and how to appropriately wear a mask, what sorts of things, not to do with a mask. And it doesn't do you any good if you wear a mask and then you touch it and then you touch your face, right? Make sure they get some basic instruction on that. And then you should have on site a designated location for soiled masks. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a epidemiologist. And I don't know all of the best practices for instructing people with PPE, but your safety manager should know that. And I know that there are OSHA and CDC links that we can make available for some of that training if you need it. Just let us know. Okay. March through here. The next set of requirements. So choke point control. Okay. Part of the executive order, if you're going to go back to work, requires you now to say, okay, where are my choke points on the projects? Where are the high-risk areas? Hallways, water station, break areas, elevators, right, in the high-rise situation. And there what the executive order is saying is you need to control those choke points to make sure that people maintain 6 feet or they're wearing masks if they can't, and you got to limit the traffic, right? And so make sure for each of your projects, you can say, okay, these are the identified choke points, and these are the 3 or 4 things that we're instructing people to do. Make sure your superintendents, the foremen, the managers, and the employees understand how choke point control is going to work. Okay, that'll be an important one as well. Next one, make sure you got hand washing, hand sanitizing stations that are available and easily accessible, right? If you got people working on one part of a building and there's one hand washing or sanitizing station for 50 people, that's probably not great. There's no mathematical formula or regulation or standard here, right? It's common sense. So make sure when, if you look at your project, you say, okay, well, where do we need hand washing stations? How many people do we have? What's reasonable? Look at your resources that are available to you. I understand it may be hard to find these things, right? But make sure you're conscious about going through that and putting these wherever you can. And I'm sure we'll get some additional follow-up guidance on this, but I mean, we all know, when it's, use your common sense. If I can't hand wash quickly, or I got to walk, all the way across the job site and talk to everybody or walk through other work areas, well, then That's not going to be acceptable. We want something that's, easily available to employees, so when they need to wash their hands, they can. Okay. If there are positive cases of any worker, visitor, owner, representative, contractors need to notify the owner, and they need to notify the other contractors on the project, right? And so how this should work is the general contractor should be notified, or the construction manager, whoever's running it, and they should have protocol to make sure the appropriate people get notified. And I'll say this, and we've got some model language and plans that we've worked with others on, and we can help in this regard. But you want to make sure that this is done absolutely step by step. What you don't want is people saying, oh my goodness, Eastland contractor, foreman, Smith, he's got COVID, and it just spreads like wildfire. You want to control the message, right? You want to say, here's the person. You can send out a notice to all of the employees or the different affected contractors saying, the contract, this person, we don't give their name typically unless they give us permission, because we want to protect their medical confidentiality. Maybe they give you your permission, but you want to say they've been removed from the site. This is the area that they were in. We're disinfecting, we're cleaning, right? You want to get that message out. You want to be proactive on that so you control and you don't have mass hysteria among the workers. So you do that, you work with the health, public health officials to the extent necessary, and then you have to have a plan to contact trace, which means you have to figure out, okay, we're going to interview Keith because Keith tested positive. In the last 14 days, who have you had close contact with? In close contact, we're talking about 10, 15 minutes of extended close contact, and we're working closely together. Not, hey, I walked by you in the hallway, or we rode up on the elevator together for 5 minutes. That's not, close contact necessarily. But then you got to identify all those folks and make sure that they are taken or removed from the job site and not permitted to come back unless they meet the requirements that we're going to talk about as well. So you can see how making sure the screening is so critical, because if you get somebody that does have symptoms or is testing positive and then they have interaction with everybody on the site, that could easily take away a significant number of workers on the project. So we want to make sure that you have that protocol. And again, you can call me and call Miller Johnson Lawyers. We've got samples. We can work through that with you. And the last bullet point on this slide is create protocols for minimizing personal contact for material delivery suppliers. So if you've got drivers that need to drop things off, how are they going to do that? Make sure that you tell them, okay, this is what we expect. You can call this person. Here's their cell phone number. You let them know when they have the delivery. And my advice is still screen the driver. They're a visitor. They're coming to the site. Maybe you don't need to give them a form or questionnaire. Maybe you can email it to them, have them email it back to you so you don't have to have any contact. But make sure you're not just allowing, because if you do all this work for the tradesman on the job, make sure you're doing the same sorts of things for material delivery. Okay. All right, some additional thoughts. And then I think what I'll do is once I get done going through all of this, I'll take a look at the questions that have come in, and I'll stick around and answer as many of those as we can. So first additional thought from me is this is all about communication. Owners, general contractors, construction managers, right? Set the tone, right? Whoever the leaders are on the projects need to communicate the expectations, and so that everybody can coordinate efforts. Because you want this to be smooth. You don't want this to be something that if there is a positive test, people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. You've got to avoid that. Okay. Develop your plan and requirements. So you're going to have a preparedness plan, right? And that's for the company. And I should note that preparedness plan needs to be available at the company headquarters and on site. I would make it available both places. But I think that there are additional plans here, right? So I know some general contractors are, developing a plan that says that they can give to all their contractors that says, this is what we expect. This is how we're going to handle it on our jobs. And that's a different plan, and that can be part of your overall preparedness plan. But that's a protocol or part of that plan, but that's a separate attachment to the plan. It's something that should be given to every business that's going to be operating on the site, so they know their expectation, and maybe you do that with a meeting. Okay, so if you have, and same thing for downline subs, make sure your subcontractors have their own preparedness plan. Make sure that they are screening. If you're going to require them to do the screenings of their own people, make sure that they're doing it correctly, okay? Communication strategy, I talked about this already. What are you going to say to your own employees about working, about what you're doing to make sure that it is safe to come back or to continue to work, and how are you going to communicate to them if you have a positive test? Again, you know people in the industry, you have friends, you have colleagues that have probably already done some of this. You can borrow some of that if they want to give it to you. Miller Johnson has samples that we've done this for, but it's about preparation, making sure that your point of contact, who's ever in control of that, knows kind of where to go and what you guys want to say. What about employee travel? Have you thought about that? What if I want to go to New Jersey to visit my parents? Maybe that's a bad idea because I can't see them. I just can wave to them through some glass. But, you know, it's not uncommon. I know I've had situations where people have had to travel because they have a sick relative in another state. What are you going to do when they come back? Are you going to quarantine them for 14 days? I don't think that's required unless they've been exposed to COVID-19 in a confirmed test, or they're having symptoms. Of course, that's different. But if I just go and come back, well, I went to a hospital in Chicago, let's say. How are you going to handle that, right? You need workers to come back, and if you screen them and there are CDC requirements, that's a one-page document. I can send it to anybody that hasn't seen it already, but the CDC has guidance on, okay, if there's a potential exposure, this is what you do to allow them to return to work. And if you're following all those things, maybe they come back to work. But you need to think about that, because what message is that going to send to the other folks on the crew, the other guys and gals on the crew? Well, he just went to Chicago. We don't want him back. So you got to manage that employee relations issue. So think about that. What are you going to do for an employee that travels? Another additional thought: if you haven't been operating and you're resuming operations, or you're gearing back up to 100%, you may have application of the FFCRA, right? The Families First Corona Response Act, which is the paid sick leave for up to 10 days, as well as paid family medical leave for an additional 10 weeks after that for the covered reasons. We've got webinars on Miller Johnson's site. We can walk through all those things with you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that this morning because it's beyond the scope of the interview and your time's precious. But think about those issues. Do you have the right forms? Does your HR understand how that is all going to work, and then how you get tax credits for making payments for that paid leave, et cetera? What are you going to do about a refusal to work, right? You got 90% of your people off, that they're all coming back. You're going to have people that say, hey, I don't think it's safe to come back. I don't want to come back. Well, then you got to do an analysis. What are the reasons they don't want to come back? Are they eligible for the FFCR paid sick leave? Maybe they are. Are they eligible for FMLA? Are they immunocompromised? Might they have a disability that we need to accommodate through a reasonable accommodation? Do we engage in that process? And if it just comes down to, hey, I don't think I want to work, well, they just said it was for safety reason. Is that protected conduct under MIOSHA? There's a lawsuit I saw filed a couple weeks ago in the east side of the state where they said that the person got fired because they didn't want to come to work because they didn't feel safe. Do you want to be in that legal risk area? What are the facts? This could easily be concerted protected activity, right? Doesn't have to be union. It could be, hey, I think it's unsafe for me and my coworkers, so I'm not coming to work. Well, essentially, I'm on strike. That's protected activity. That's concerted protected. I'm doing it because I think all the workers aren't safe. You want to communicate with that employee. You want to show them that it is safe. But if ultimately they say, I'm not coming to work, and you say, well, you're fired, you could have some serious legal risk there, because that could be protected activity and then you fired them. So you need to think through those refusal to work issues. We've done other webinars on that piece. My general advice is if you're thinking about deeming somebody a quit or terminating them, I would say two things. One is think about whether practically in this world you want that news story. You want the media saying, XYZ construction company fires employee because he didn't think it was safe. I don't think you want that. Second, there's some legal risk, and you got to make sure you talk to your lawyer about, what the facts are and can we really deem this a quit. The more practical solution from our perspective has been you put them on the shelf, you put them in some sort of unpaid leave status, and if it's consistent with your policies, you often might not need to pay them health insurance, right? You can end their health insurance because a lot of times people say, well, yeah, but then if I don't let them go, then they're going to get unemployment. They're likely going to get unemployment anyway, either way. So, that's a battle you can technically, there's some arguments we can make for you there, but that's going to be an uphill battle that a lot of employers aren't going to fight. And so, but at some point, practically what I've been suggesting is you put them on an unpaid leave. Okay. And you say, well, we're going to give you some time to think about it and you need to come back. And then at some point you can give them a cutoff date and say, okay, if you're not going to come back by X date, this has become an indefinite time off and we can no longer accommodate that. And then you've managed your risk and you've moved on. But I think just the immediate knee-jerk reaction of, oh, you don't want to come to work, you're fired. And you also need to be ready for work stoppages on the construction site, right? It could be, unions could call off folks on your project because somebody tests positive, right? What are your contingency plans for a work stoppage? You need to dust those off and think about that. We saw it in Romulus, Amazon distribution center in Romulus, Michigan, where they walked off the job, right? What are you going to do if that happens? Are you prepared? I mean, obviously you can't just fire everyone because it's protected activity to the extent that they're striking for the improved working conditions on behalf of the others. So make sure you've thought about that. And certainly I can drone on all day about that stuff because I'm a labor lawyer and I love it. But for purposes of this morning, something to think about. Okay. And then let's talk about EEO 36. I promised you we'd come back to that, and I'm going to do that. So EEO 2020-36. Remember, for directly impacted workers, and when I say directly impacted workers, what I'm talking about is somebody that is test positive or that has one of the principal symptoms, right? Which is fever, atypical shortness of breath, those types of things, right? That's what we're looking for, or an atypical cough. And if you're directly affected by COVID, then you need to stay home under the executive order for 3 days after your symptoms have resolved, so for at least 3 days, and 7 days after the symptoms first appeared or you were swabbed for a positive test, okay? So it's going to be a minimum 7 days there that they're going to be self-quarantined, okay? Or I can come back, leave my house if I get a negative test, right? So the negative test would make that go away. But then we have the issue of workers in close contact, right? So one person on your job site tests positive, they've had close contact with 15 others. Well, those 15 other employees need to stay home for 14 days after the time has passed since their last contact with the infected person, okay? Or the at-risk person, the person with symptoms, okay? So that means that if I'm allowed to walk through the project and there's 20 or 15 people, those 20 or 15 people that fall within that close contact, the contact tracing we're talking about, they need to stay home for 14 days from the last contact with Eastland. Well, you can imagine that a lot of workers are going to be like, what are you talking about? I'm asymptomatic. I saw him in the elevator that one day, or we worked closely one day, but I don't have any symptoms. I need to work. I want to work. B, you want groups of people to work. You need to meet the deadlines. So the practical solution there is those are the folks you want to make sure that they can get a test. Because if they can get a negative test, then you can get them back, right? And so, and I know testing is in short demand. It's supposed to be increasing in availability as we speak. But if you have access and resources to testing, I'm suggesting you think about and use that judiciously, right? Make sure that you're using it for people you really need on the job, right? If you've got a group of folks that, you know, are off and they're the electricians and that part of the project isn't critical at that time, maybe you stomach the 14 days. Those are all sort of things to think about. But don't forget those EO requirements, because I think they're very important. And the last thing that I'm going to say before we take a look at some of the questions is consider what you're going to do when someone comes back to work, because there are different situations, right? Obviously, if they have a negative test, that's great. That's a return to work clearance. But what if they're hospitalized, right? You might also want to require medical documentation to return to work. Incidentally, the EEOC in the last week or so has issued guidance saying that it is okay to require a employee or worker to have a negative test to return to work. So if you really want to be strict, you can do that under the EEOC's guidance. You know, you got to consider what message that sends to the workers. Maybe it's a good message because it says if you've tested positive, we're not allowing a single person back unless they have a negative test. That's going to provide assurances to a lot of people. And maybe it's negative because you're like, well, everybody that's been potentially exposed isn't getting to work. This is ridiculous. Those are all questions, and I'm not saying they're easy. They may be difficult, that you should be thinking through. So think about your return to work clearance. All right. So stay safe, be careful out there. COVID-19 is not a joke. Please don't take offense to this, but I do think it's important to laugh a little, right? And when I saw this, I thought, okay, I could see this on the construction site, right? Some guy thinks it's funny, coughs on somebody, and he gets clocked, right? This is serious, and I know you guys all know that, but it's important that we convey that to all the workers, all the subcontractors, everybody on these projects, because it's a big victory in the sense that you guys are going back to work. It's critical to your businesses. You guys have suffered long enough, and I want to make sure that you know, you guys aren't dialed back by the governor, because I think that would be a real problem. So I'm going to take a few moments here if you want to type in some questions, but I'm going to look for some common questions, and I'll try to answer them live, and the ones I don't get to, I will, you can email me afterwards, and we can go from there. All right. First question. The Executive Order 36 sounds like it conflicts with CDC guidance. Yes, very astute observation. It does, right? Well, it's really confusing because the Executive Order 70 suggests that you should follow all the CDC guidance, but then you have more specific EO 36. And so our position is follow the EO 36 guidance, even though the CDC guidance says, hey, if you've been in close contact, you're potentially exposed, you can work as long as you follow that one sheet of guidance. But the Michigan executive order is saying you shouldn't, it's public policy not to, and so those people ought to stay home. That's the public policy of Michigan. I think to be safe, you follow that Michigan rule. If you want to be more aggressive for some reason, I'm happy to talk to you about those legal risks and how we can manage them and whether or not the Executive Order 36 is really enforceable. But I think that aggressive position, you always have to look at the lens of how's that going to be viewed by your owners, your customers, your employees, the public, if you're not doing these things that the governor says and things go poorly on your job site, right? It spreads quickly and someone says, well, XYZ Mechanical didn't follow EO 36 and they let everybody work. Yeah, I get it. We can say, but we followed CDC guidance. That's a judgment call, but very good question. All right. Norm Brady, some of you may know Norm, I do. He asks a very good question. Who enforces the return to work requirements? So the enforcement mechanism in the executive order is it makes a violation a civil misdemeanor, a civil infraction and a misdemeanor, right? So, and you can get a fine and a misdemeanor. Now, that's supposed to be enforced by local law enforcement. Can my OSHA enforce this? I think they can try to do that, but there's nothing in the executive order that says this has the effect of a my OSHA rule or standard. Okay, so if my OSHA is going to do an investigation and say you're not complying with these things, and I have one of these for a client in a different state right now. They use the state has general OSHA requirements, and they sent a letter saying we've got complaints that you haven't done everything that's required under the Ohio executive orders, and we wrote back saying no, we have done that. The client has done that, and oh, by the way, that executive order is not enforceable by OSHA. OSHA hasn't cited a specific standard or rule that was properly enforced under OSHA, and so we don't think you have the jurisdiction. And so I think we should take that same approach, right? If my OSHA takes the view that they can enforce these things, certainly we want to cooperate with them to show that we are doing these things. But I also think you need to preserve your rights legally that, hey, where's the standard? Make OSHA tell us, my OSHA tell us what is the standard. And I know everyone's going to say, well, what about the general duties clause? Well, the general duties clause, I mean, there has to be a determination that this is a significant harm, and I can't remember the exact language in the general duties clause. I think it says something to the effect you have to keep employees free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Well, I mean, is COVID likely to do that? I think there's an argument that it isn't, and the general duties clause this doesn't necessarily apply. So, short answer to sum up the long answer, I should say, there's nothing that commits to my OSHA or delegates to my OSHA enforcement of Executive Order 70. It should be the local authorities. If that changes, then we're going to want to understand from my OSHA, and we'll get to the bottom of that. If you get a letter or request for information, if you get an inspector, you can call us. We can get involved, or whoever you work with, get involved and make sure, look, we're happy to cooperate and give you information to show that we're working safely. But we want to understand the basis for the request for information and the basis for any potential inspection, because obviously we have a right to notice an opportunity under the law, and we just want to understand how the positions my OSHA is taking. So, and we'll provide updates. That's one of the things I guess I will push for our return to work resource page. We've committed to updating that weekly, and then that, as things develop, that's the kind of things we're going to develop. I know Norm and his group ABC will be updating those as well, so that's another resource that you have. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Bruce asks, would gloves and masks truly be necessary for trades where the work doesn't require it? I think I answered that earlier. Maybe this is unclear. Yeah, you don't have to wear the gloves and masks. Well, for the masks, you don't have to wear them if they can keep social distance 6 feet apart. That's fine as long as the mask. Then you're just going to be, what's the task require? Obviously, if it's a respirator is required, that's a separate. You guys know how to do that. Gloves, agreed. Have the gloves available, and then if they need them for the task, then they should wear those. Let's see if I can find a couple others, and then I'm going to let everybody go and get. Are daily health screenings required while the stay-at-home order is in place, or is this required for the foreseeable future? It is required. The daily screenings are required as long as the Executive Order 70 or whatever follows it is in place. That will run through May 15th. My guess is that'll be extended, but for now it's May 15th. Does the requirement fall on the general contractor, construction manager, if the trade contractor sends people who are not equipped without proper PPE or training. I think it falls predominantly on the trade contractor, but it will flow uphill because the general contractor construction manager needs to have a site-specific supervisor responsible for the plan on the site. So I think that the state would come in and say, okay, who's principally responsible for, and you could say, what's the general? It's the specific sub that the trade contractor who's not following the law. But I do think that there is also responsibility for the general and the construction manager to show that we told them of the requirements, and we have a protocol in place to make sure and to be checking on things, right? I get it, you can't babysit every aspect of this, but I think you want to be in a position to show that you took efforts to make sure that every business, every subcontractor on the project is aware of what needs to be done. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. If you've got specific questions you want to email me, please do so. Happy to respond to those today. Like I said, we hope to get that the resource page is up and running, and the construction specific industry links that we have put together will be up there later today. I thank everybody for your participation this morning, and we look forward to providing additional resources for you guys as you get back to work. So everybody have an awesome day, and don't social distance anyone's behind. Thanks a lot.